Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
The idea that the world can just split itself up into two halves. And I don't mean to be dramatic here, but can you imagine that we live in a time where it is possible to empathize over the suffering of one child and not another? And it is possible for the other side to empathize with one child and not the other. But that's actually what's happened in the last 2 months. Think of how much we have changed as the world, that we are able to see this. And still, nothing seems to bring those two halves together. In the Ukraine crisis, we did see the bombing of civilians. And yes, there's a history. And to be honest, this evening, I am not going into the history. But right now, we're just looking at how we have changed. How has the world changed? What is changing around us in terms of what we are seeing in the present?
A month into Israel's strikes on Gaza in retaliation for Hamas terror attacks, is the world on the brink of a bigger war with repercussions across West Asia? What are the likely off-ramps that could see a peaceful outcome now, and how could the continuing violence impact the world? And amidst growing global polarization, what are India's options, and is there a possible role in ending the crisis at hand? Suhasini Haidar, diplomatic editor of The Hindu, chronicles the story of the struggle and India's relationship and the role it has evolved in this episode of BIC Talks. Now, over to Suhasini.
I was interested by the word neutral, because as we all know, when it comes to conflicts of this kind, whether it is India-Pakistan, whether it is Israel-Palestine, whether it is, there's a famous phrase that if it has the same name in the country, like North Korea, South Korea, North Sudan, South Sudan, then they're probably at war with each other. So neutrality itself is a subject for another day. But what I'm going to try to do for you in the next 45 minutes or so is give a sense of not just where we are, but also really, is this just going to be the same sort of cycle we see again and again with increasing amounts of bloodshed? After all, 100 years ago, or right now we're still at 80 years ago, we took a pledge as the world to say, never again. Never again was not just about one part of the conflict or another. It was about ending conflict, the setting up of the United Nations in 1945. So the idea that we are now looking, and everywhere we look, we see more conflict. I, as a journalist, I have to say, even I'm a little scared to see what tomorrow's newspaper will bring, because you know that it is more and more contested. The idea of what you're reading is also contested. Not everybody believes what they are reading, or only believes it if it agrees with what they already think. We live in little bubbles of opinion where it is harder and harder to find that middle ground. And that middle ground, I don't mean somebody who's just equivocal to all and says, this is fine and that's fine too. But that middle ground for real engagement, where I put an idea across, you give me your ideas, we try to convince each other. We may succeed, we may not, but we part on good terms. Those areas are now under the greatest threat. And I see from a lot of people nodding around here that they feel it. And it's not just here. Let me tell you, in every part of the world, I hear about these contestations. So to start with, what happened? And you have the map right here. And of course, you would have heard that it is shaped like a dagger in the heart of West Asia. Some have called it the jewel dagger. We've seen those pictures as well. But the actual fact is, when you see a strip of land like this, and you realize how difficult it is inside, it makes one think about our own country and say, with a large country like ours, maybe we can find ways for a little more space for such middle ground. On October 7th this year, the world witnessed an attack that Israel called its game changer. A series of attacks by Hamas, by the Hamas group, militants along the Gaza boundary with Israel, that horrified the world with their brutality, as everyone from small babies to senior citizens, from unsuspecting motorists to music concert-going teens, all were slaughtered. 1,200 Israelis were killed that morning. It's not even in a day. 245 taken hostage. I was just a couple of weeks ago one of a group of journalists that were asked to view an hour of footage. And that footage had not been taken by other people. They were pictures that had been taken either from the body cams that terrorists themselves wore, or from dash cams on their motors, or from the cell phones of dead Hamas terrorists who were, killed in the action that followed. So this was stitched together for about an hour, and we were asked to watch it just to make up our own minds about what we had seen. So I would say that there is little doubt that all that I've just said is not in doubt, or that the release of those hostages, 5 of the 245 are now home, 240 are hostage, is uppermost on the minds of all concerned. There's also little doubt of what followed. Israeli Defense Forces ordered a major crackdown on Gaza. They stopped food, water, fuel, and with some exceptions, they actually shut down the entire area. They forced nearly 1 million people living in the north of Gaza to the south, sustained a bombing campaign. For about a month, we've seen a little sort of lessening of the bombing campaign simply because we now have ground troops in Gaza City. And they said in the first 6 days, so just for a sense of what kind of bombing campaign it was, in the first 6 days, the IDF said it had dropped 6,000 bombs. That's 1,000 bombs a day over this small area, more than what was used in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in ISIS-held Syria for any length of time. Refugee centers, schools, hospitals, so many hospitals have been bombed by now. The death toll, we're told, has crossed 15,000. About a third of those are children. Doctors have been killed, journalists have been killed, UN aid workers have been killed, and the UN aid workers is the maximum number in any recent conflict. IDF says that's because Hamas uses them as shields and runs its operations from below these facilities. However, a month later, and we do have to do some stock taking because we're now at November 17th, there seems to be no sign of the 240 hostages. We're told a possible deal is in the works. Nor is there any sign of the Hamas militant leadership in Gaza. That's where we stand today. From my description, you can just imagine how difficult it is because I've built one scenario for you, another scenario for you, and then you have to somehow over there say, how do we build policy on this? We're not in Israel, we're not in Palestine, but we need to build a policy. And that's the bulk of what I hope to speak to you really about. India, if you ask me, has 3 parallel threads going on at any time, and that's why it becomes so much more difficult. One are the ties with Palestine. So what are India's ties with Palestine? From 1948, when the first vote at the United Nations and just started for the creation of Israel, India voted against that. They said the country should be Palestine and we do not accept Israel. 2 years later, they recognized Israel, but didn't establish diplomatic relations with it. In 1967, for example, after the Six-Day War, India, through its position on the non-aligned movement, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure, at some point, actually opposed Israeli actions. In 1975, India became the first country outside of the Arab world to allow the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, to set up its office here. That office still exists. It's, of course, the Palestinian embassy now. India has consistently fought for the two-state solution with East Jerusalem as the capital. And at the United Nations, on nearly all but a few votes, has voted with the Palestinian cause. So this has been a traditional position for India. India has voted against Israeli settlements. Whenever that vote comes up, it came up a short while ago. And in 2018, Prime Minister Modi became the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Palestine. He was accorded with the Grand Cordon Award over there. So that's the ties with Palestine. Then you have the ties with Israel. And I'm sure many of you know this history, but I'll just quickly go through it. In 1950, India, as I said, set up consular ties, which meant, yes, we can do business with Israel, but we don't have full diplomatic ties. We allowed Israel to run a consulate in Mumbai that essentially looked at trade. it wasn't until 1992. So that was the position when it comes to Israel. And it wasn't until 1992, 42 years later, that India established full diplomatic relations, had an Israeli embassy in India and an Indian embassy in Tel Aviv, except for the United States and I think two others. Nobody else has their embassies in Jerusalem. They hold them in Tel Aviv, waiting for the final resolution of Jerusalem. So then ties began to pick up. They picked up for another reason too. 1992, if you remember, many things had happened. It was really a watershed moment in the world. I think today we don't see it. Maybe 30 years is too little a time to look back at that arc of history. But 50 years later, we'll say, my God, so much was going on in the world. The Berlin Wall was coming down. The Soviet Union was coming down. India had to suddenly scramble with its own economic crisis and then look around and see there was energy scarcity. Its traditional defense partner, Soviet Union, may not be able to supply it as well. So suddenly India was looking to diversify its defense. There were also economic reforms going on in India. So suddenly economic diplomacy became a very big part of Indian diplomacy. It seems strange to think about it now. When I joined the profession, which was a little bit around that time, I remember when prime ministers visited other countries, we only really spoke about the big strategic agreements between the two countries, the trade deals that were done, the government to government, the business to business deals that were done were normally just relegated to the side because, prime ministers didn't speak about business. But so much has changed. And that is one great indicator for me of how much changed at that time. And so did our relationship with Israel. Suddenly we started looking at Israel. And I can tell you, and I'm sure all of those who have visited Israel, visited West Asia, can see the obvious affinities we have with people there. We had students starting to go there. Business, of course, began to boom. And this was all from 1992 to 2003, when the first Israeli prime ministerial visit to India. 2003 was when Ariel Sharon came to India. I remember being, asked by various diplomats whether they thought there would be huge protests in India. There was this idea that India stood with Palestine, in which case, will there be big protests when he comes? And I said, honestly, I don't think so. I think we are able somehow to see our traditional support for the Palestinian cause and put that in a box that is slightly different from our relationship with Israel. We're able to do that. I don't know if today I can say the same thing, but for the moment, I think we do, and I'll tell you why just now. So that was 2003, and then, you saw more and more visits, high-level leader visits. 2017, Prime Minister Modi became the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Israel. India has changed a few of its votes at the UN, changed some of its language that is not so critical of Israel anymore. One big shift, if you'd like to see, is in 2018, Israel began a bombing campaign on Gaza because they had been hit by rocket attacks in Jerusalem. And it was over the period of a month. There was a UN General Assembly vote at the time. By the time of the vote, I think about 229 people had died. India voted for the resolution. But on October 26th, last month, by then I think about 10,000 people had died, about 3,000 children. India shifted its vote to abstain. So there are some changes. It's not as if everything is, traditional, so that's how we go. But these are some of these balances that India, the Ministry of External Affairs, the Prime Minister's Office, South Bloc is dealing with. And of course, we do have diplomats in our midst here, so they can speak a little bit more about what goes on when these discussions are done. There have been other shifts that India has done. So if the first part of India's, I said 3 parallel threads, and if the first part was about bilateral ties, the second part is about principles. Where does India stand? There's this lovely tribal idea of the world, which we're seeing now. It's not very lovely, which basically goes with the idea of where you stand depends on where you sit. And if I'm with these people, then everything they do is fine and everything the other side does is wrong. That was something that we walked away from in 1945. The world said, we are no longer going to divide ourselves up in this way, and which is why the UN Security Council was built as it was. The idea was that they could make progress. Today, they stand practically paralyzed because you're the blue states and red states, as Mr. Obama said about the United States. So the second place where India's threads, if you like, where it stands, is on principle. On the one side, India has a position on terrorism. On the other, it has a position on civilian killings. What do we mean by that? I mean, can those two go together? As a victim of terror, India has consistently called for a global standard in responses. I think most of you would remember the 1999 IC-814 hijack. What really stood out for most of us, and as a journalist, I can remember actually being on the tarmac when the IC-814 finally came home. And what was really, stood out for those 7 days when the plane was there in Kandahar airport was the sheer callousness with which the rest of the world looked at this event. There's a plane full of 300 people, and they're being held hostage in Kandahar. Think about it. It was Christmas when they were hijacked, New Year's Eve when they were freed. So in the coldest time of the year, there they were in Taliban-held Afghanistan. Nobody knew what could happen to them. The plane itself was in really bad condition. And yet no one in the world wanted to stand up and say, this is terrorism that affects everyone, because you just have to be a human to empathize with that situation. And we saw that. We saw the world as the person who was released in exchange for that entire plane of mostly Indians, walked across on television cameras and was not held accountable. When 9/11 happened, there were many who said, maybe now the world sees, maybe now the rest of the world sees that terrorism is something that affects us all. I think it wasn't until 26/11 and the Mumbai attacks that we saw the world suddenly dealing with this truth, that terrorism, you no longer sort of made distinctions when it came to a terror attack. What is a terror attack? And I can go on about this because we have a situation now where we call everything a terror attack. Every soldier that dies is a martyr. Every attack that is done by non-state actors is called a terrorist strike. But we know that there are some distinctions. But essentially, a terror attack is an attack designed to spread fear or terror amongst the larger civilian population. That's why an airport gets hit, or that's why a mall gets hit. And here we saw that the kind of terror strikes we saw, and they're from every part of the world, had a certain common thread, and they needed to be dealt with in a common sort of global way. That's actually something that started after 26/11, and I think we do have a greater global understanding, although we all know that there are still many standards, global standards for how many of one attack before it comes on the front pages or before a government changes policy because of it. But at the UNGA vote that I just told you about, the government actually said that they abstained or they shifted simply because there was no explicit reference to the October 7th attacks. Of course, since then, India has voted for other draft resolutions that don't include the October 7th attacks. So now we're in a bit of confusion here, but it isn't confusion. That's what I'm trying to say, that you have these principles. You have the principle of the stand on terrorism, or what people love to call zero tolerance for terrorism. And on the other hand, you have your position on civilian killings, on the need for dialogue and diplomacy. This is something India has always spoken about. And India's position as the voice for the voiceless. How can you stay quiet if the day begins with pictures of the kind of bombings we have seen in Gaza? And we can hear again and again that people are trying to avoid civilian casualties. We can hear again and again from the United States the desire for something new. It's a term I haven't heard before. It's called humanitarian pauses. I've heard of a humanitarian pause. I've heard of a ceasefire. But what are humanitarian pauses? It literally means that you stop the bombing in order to allow food into the people, and then you keep bombing them. It, to me, does not make any sense. But here we've got this new term, and many are using it. In that position, how do you stay quiet watching those everyday killings? So you've got first ties with Israel, ties with Palestine. Then you have zero tolerance policy on terrorism, but the voice for the voiceless, the idea against killing of civilians, restraint. In fact, Prime Minister Modi spoke about restraint a few days ago, on Friday, actually, at the Voice of Global South summit that he spoke. And it's a very important quote he made over there. He said, when the terror attacks happened, of course, full solidarity with Israel. but we also counseled restraint, the need for dialogue and diplomacy. Okay, some are going to turn around and say, okay, India needs to do some of this itself. But really, it is important, it is intrinsic. That's why this balance is coming around. Many of us think that India's foreign policy is completely hostage to India's politics. And it is possible to say, this government did this government did this. But actually, we all know that foreign policy has a certain base, it has a certain continuum, and it has a certain evolution. It does not have these knee-jerk kind of changes. And particularly, I don't think it does in India. And you're most welcome to disagree with me on that. So why has India done this? And the third, so bilateral ties, principles. And the third is really about rights and duties. The principle when it comes to rights is the right to self-defense. After all, in 2016, India announced for the first time, because we've done these operations quite a few times across the line of control with Pakistan, but in 2016, India announced that our soldiers had crossed the UN-monitored line of control into Pakistan and taken out terror camps over there. I think even today, nobody really knows how many were killed, but India did it. In 2019, there was the Pulwama attack on soldiers, and the response to that was the Balakot strikes. Of course, then there was a counter response to that as well. But there is this concept of the right to self-defense that has taken root and has been used as much as possible. At the same time, there is the other. So, I'm literally making you all yo-yo from here to here, because actually you're saying there are no wrongs over here. Everything everyone's saying is right, and yet we have to make choices, and yet we have to make policy. So on the other side, there's the importance of international law, the rule of international order. We use these terms all day, every day, as well as UN conventions that we've signed on to, the UN conventions on human rights, the UN conventions on protecting children, the UN conventions that ensure that hospitals are not seen as places that can be used in a war. They are not military combatants. And even if a hospital is sheltering military combatants or militant combatants, there are certain laws that prevail over there when it comes to proportionalism and all the rest. And of course, those are all conversations we can have, but we're still left with the same question, which are, what are India's options in the Israel-Hamas war? So I'll come to the next part of what I want to say, which is that there is this conflict over here that is growing for the moment. We don't see an end to it. Of course, it could come very quickly to an end, the release of hostages, the cessation of violence, but then what? This is, in a sense, what I said right at the beginning. If the Israeli government said this is a game changer, something has changed, something has shifted quite dramatically, because we all know what the conditions in Gaza today are. We all know that half of the population in Gaza, or nearly half, has been forced into half of the land. That means double the size of the population is in half the land right now. So what will that mean? What will be the wider impact of the crises? Because we as Indians should look at those as well. The first part, I think, has to be the understanding of the global polarization that we today witness. Whether it was on Ukraine, whether it could be in a future conflict in Taiwan, or whether it is in this Middle East conflict. The idea that the world can just split itself up into two halves, and I don't mean to be dramatic here, but can you imagine that we live in a time where it is possible to empathize over the suffering of one child and not another? And it is possible for the other side to empathize with one child and not the other. But that's actually what's happened in the last 2 months. Think of how much we have changed as the world, that we are able to see this, and still nothing seems to bring those two halves together. In the Ukraine crisis, we did see the bombing of civilians. And yes, there's a history. And to be honest, this evening, I'm not going into the history. I'm not going into the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, simply because that is something everyone has to engage with at some point. But right now, we're just looking at how we have changed. How has the world changed? What is changing around us in terms of what we are seeing in the present? So you saw this world, not just going into two halves in terms of I'm right and he's right and, that sort of thing. But on basic principles, you had a situation, regardless of which side of the divide you were over, where a German Philharmonic orchestra composer had to step down because he refused to denounce what the Russian government had done back in Russia. We saw similar things happen, suddenly I think a Greek university stopped being able to teach Tolstoy. You saw a kind of splitting of the mind, as if we now no longer need to engage with centuries of civilization on the other side that we have always engaged with. You saw it when it came to the financial sanctions and the way the world started suddenly talking about de-dollarization. It may not have come, but we've had very, very arguably successful conversations about people who want to work in a different currency. And that could be half the world. So we have this growing global polarization that we need to deal with. The second, of course, we need to deal with what happens if the progress of the last few years, and in the last few years, we saw not just the Abraham Accords, where Israel established diplomatic ties with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, but what also was about to happen, and possibly the US president has said this was one of the reasons for the timing of the attack, was the Saudi Arabia-Israel détente. This would have been something really unimaginable. So what happens now to all of that? The Saudi normalization with Israel has been put on hold for the moment. Will this change Abraham Accords? If this conflict continues, we have to watch. We need to think now about what the future of Gaza, the refugees from Gaza, the impact on the countries bordering Gaza, certainly Egypt, Jordan, which is on the other side, Saudi Arabia is just below this map. So what happens to the refugees from Gaza? They've grown up in one place. Maybe they certainly can't go back home. 750,000, I think, who have left now don't have homes to go back to. In the first week alone of the bombardment, I think something like 15,000 buildings came down. So you don't have homes to go back to. People will be refugees. Can this world afford another refugee crisis, looking at what we have seen, whether it was Ukraine, whether it was Syria, whether it's been Afghanistan? There have just been so many conflicts in the last few years that another refugee crisis, this is not even something we're engaging with right now, because we're just looking at the bombardment for the moment. But there is going to be an impact. The impact on the Palestinian movement. We have all taken it for granted. And certainly, as I said earlier, India has dealt with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. It then dealt with Fatah, which controls the West Bank on this side. Not so much with Hamas. But what happens to Fatah itself? It has been shown up as totally ineffectual in stopping Israel's operations against Palestinians, or of getting the world to empathize enough to do something about it. So now, will there be more militant, Hamas-style organizations coming up on the West Bank as well? I think if I was living in Israel today, I would really think about this point, about what this 1 month has actually meant for how the politics of the region is going to change. There are some other questions that have been asked, and I think those questions are basically being asked in Israel right now. And any of you who's reading the Haaretz or following television there or seeing some of the YouTube videos are seeing these questions being asked about Israel's own ability to protect itself after October 7th. How did this attack evade intelligence, counteraction, pursuit of attackers? Bringing back the hostages still doesn't seem to be possible. These are all problems that show up Israeli security capacity in a certain way. And remember, we thought of them as invincible in many ways. I mean, we all watch the Israeli television shows, Fauda and all the rest. And really, that is how Israelis themselves saw their intelligence agencies and their defense forces. So that is changing as well at this time. I'll run through the other impacts that we are seeing. The US, the global leader, if you like, the unipolar world superpower, is seeing its resources getting more and more stretched. What is that going to mean for other conflicts in the world? Is it just going to be each country for itself without anyone to stop them? Because we've now run the course. The US can't do anything in countries where it is opposed, like the Russia-Ukraine war. It can't do anything in countries where they're the biggest allies, in Israel, for example. President Biden was asked, how do you deal with what is now the new buzzword, which is polycrises? And yes, we live in a time of polycrises. And he said, we are the United States, for God's sake, basically meaning we can handle Middle East, we can handle Taiwan, we can handle Ukraine all at the same time. But his own words, when alluding to Afghanistan and how that ended just a month ago, he said, justice must be done. But I caution you that while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it, admitting that the US had made mistakes when it came to Afghanistan. So even though we don't count Afghanistan in these polycrises we're talking about right now, remember how that ended and how it continues. We are still in touch with women there who don't know what their future is going to be. And this was a world that, passed all kinds of resolutions, signed all kinds of documents until today. So 2 years into the Taliban rule of Afghanistan, cannot actually prevail upon the government there to do something simple, like allow girls to go to schools. The schools were already made for them. They just had to allow them to go to school. And even that is something the global order is not able to do. We're seeing the impact, and now I go back to the idea of what is going to happen in the Middle East. Regional connectivity, I2U2, trade initiatives, the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. Is it going to mean anything? Because you know where it runs from. It runs from the UAE, somewhere here in this map, over there, through Saudi Arabia, up through Jordan, through Israel, and on to Greece. I don't think the last month has left anyone in any doubt that this is going to be impacted, that even if there is complete peace in the region, or the absence of violence, I should call it, not actual peace, that's not going to make it easier to carry out these regional trade initiatives and connectivity initiatives. A rise in anti-Semitic and Islamophobia sentiments in every part of the world. We've already seen police clashing with radical protesters, identity-based attacks on people in the US, in Europe, in China. It spreads. And finally, I think, and much of what I've spoken about is the big impact, is that of a UN, a United Nations, a world order in decline. The killing of UN workers. I mean, I thought the biggest blow to the UN, in a sense, or its capacities or its credibility, was when Russia decided and President Putin ordered the strikes on Ukraine as a meeting of the UN Security Council was actually underway. But now we see something else, where the UN RWA is saying our workers are being killed every day. The UN Secretary General actually said more UN aid workers have died in Gaza than in any comparable period of history. These are his words, not mine. So no one's heeding to the call for a ceasefire. I mean, in the old days, the idea that a ceasefire was the first thing you asked for. But today, we don't have a situation where the United Nations can unanimously ask for it. There was a vote at the UNGA calling for a ceasefire. It got 145 yeses. But then it wasn't unanimous. And India, of course, abstained over there as well. And the willful violation of all of these international humanitarian laws, people explaining them in different ways that we've seen. So if any of you have been counting, those are 10 global impacts of what we have seen just in the past month. As I said, I'm not talking about the history, but just of what we've seen in the past month, the kind of swathe of impacts that this can have across the world and where it will also impact India. So rather than focusing just on anger and the anguish statements that we are seeing from both sides, because everybody watches them on television, on YouTube, they're going everywhere on WhatsApp, it is these outcomes, these 10 outcomes that I just spoke about, that India has to learn to deal with. How does India do that? I think everyone will have a different answer to this, and I'd love to hear yours. I think the first is we must understand the underpinnings of India's historical, traditional stance. There was a stance on Palestine and how Israel was created. You have to understand the underpinnings of that. Where has that come from? Why is it that even today, some of those tenets really do hold strong? The second is, I think India needs to understand that there is a global South sentiment in this crisis, as there was in Ukraine. In the Ukraine crisis too, the global South had a certain sentiment. The sentiment was, we understand that the killing of civilians should not be acceptable. We also understand there are other problems, but that things like the sanctions, the Western sanctions that weren't UN-led sanctions, are not something we want to accept. So you had this situation during Ukraine when the UNGA voted unanimously to stop the bombing of Ukraine, to ask for a ceasefire. But out of those 140, I think it was 140 or 142 who voted for that UNGA resolution, only 40 actually joined the Western sanctions. So straight away, you're seeing now how the world is being divided, and India needs to see how that is happening. I think a lot of the pitch in the last year to the global South, which, let me tell you, I thought was one of the phrases I'd never hear again, much like non-alignment and other parts of India's South Asia, SARC policies, all the rest of that. I thought, the idea of South-South cooperation that goes back to, I think, the late 1960s had just gone away. And now we all talk about the Global South. The Prime Minister just held the Voice of Global South virtual summit, gave it a lot of importance. So the idea that the Global South does mean something. When India abstained at the UNGA last month, for example, when it shifted its vote, it was the only one in the neighborhood. So every country in the neighborhood, including Bhutan, voted for. It was the only country in the BRICS plus wider region, as well as one of the only countries in the Global South that did that. So it's worth thinking about. This is where the world is. This is where some powers are. These are where some others. The next question, obviously, is, but what about pragmatism? What about realism, for example? Our ties with Israel are so important for defense, are so important for trade, are so important for startups. Our ties with the United States, I mean, they get more important every day. When I wake up, I see something more that we are doing with the US. Just as our past ties with Russia were important when we talked about the Ukraine war. But eventually, the question will not be about whether it's one country we've dealt with or another, but it will be about the idea of strategic autonomy. If you're not actually autonomous, if you can't have a position that differs from those who you consider otherwise very important partners, then there's nothing very autonomous about this strategy at all. So we should do away with that idea. Next is the idea of the globalized standard on terrorism. And why do I come back to it? Because it's an old idea. In 1997, India went to the UN and said, we need what is called the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism. We need the world to define terrorism and then to have a global response to it. That particular convention has gone nowhere. Even today, India brings it up, but it hasn't got the kind of support that it requires. One of the reasons is many of these countries that are involved, including global powers, I should say, like the US and Russia, have soldiers involved in other crises who might be seen as helping those who are seen as terrorists. So in some way, if they are helping opposition militants, or if they're helping a non-state actor in another country, as we do know these global powers tend to do, they don't want to be seen as defining terrorism in one standard way. In other words, it's that old idea of he's an SOB, but he's my SOB versus, the other side's, excuse me for the language. It wasn't mine, it was the US president's. And finally, I think as Indians, we do need to think about what our own responses are. It is possible to look at the Mumbai attacks, as I know many have, and felt that, awful sense of disappointment that we didn't do more after the attacks. It was such a moment of failure for us collectively. The idea that 10 men could come to our most prestigious city in many ways and create the kind of havoc they did was a kind of shared humiliation, if you like, for many of us. The idea that we didn't do in kind, we didn't hit back at that time, has been the subject of a lot of debates since then. Just a few days ago, and first I read Tom Friedman in the New York Times, then there was a senior intelligence official who wrote this in The Hindu, in fact, about what were the benefits of India's response at the time. The first reaction was, let's just go hit something, because this is unbearable, the kind of carnage we saw. And I think our national security advisor at the time wrote about it in a book called Choices as well. It's a Shiv Shankar Menon book. And then he said the second response then came. And the second response was what? To galvanize world opinion towards tackling, at that time, Pakistan-based terrorists, systematically building a case towards holding those responsible to account and shutting down terror training camps. Many would argue that 15 years later, for one reason or another, that's not so far off the mark. There is an outcome that has been achieved. Even the 2016 and 2019 attacks by India in self-defense were done actually without endangering civilians. Albeit you can say they're used for political purposes, can be questioned, everyone has ideas about that. But most importantly, the message that went out, and this is what I want to end with really, is that states must not behave as humans do. Humans can feel emotion, humans can feel every part of that. But states must behave as rational structures with a long-term view for the benefit of all. Sometimes that benefit is of all your country, sometimes it's the benefit of mankind. Rage, revenge, and reprisal have little place in that view.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.